Advanced Europe History, Change and Convention in Europe. To begin with, version of this book started with 1789 and finished with 1989, accurately 200 a long time afterward. This moment version brings the story forward another 2 decades, in spite of the fact that those 2 a long time are still grapples for the book. Like all dates and periods in history, these are to some degree subjective, but these 2 a long time, 1789 and 1989, stand flag occasions in European history, seemingly the 2 most vital a long time in that continent's history. To begin with is a year of the French Transformation, which toppled the government in France, yet briefly, institutionalized the thoughts of the edification, and unleashed the strengths of patriotism, transformation, and popular government all over Europe. The moment is a year in which communism collapsed in Eastern Europe through, to a great extent, tranquil prevalent insurgencies that brought down one communist administration after another in the course of, as it were, around 6 months. These Eastern European insurgencies invigorated the fracture and collapse of the Soviet Union to a long time afterward, with the ensuing conclusion of the Cold War strife that had overwhelmed worldwide relations and much of life in both the East and the West. Since the conclusion of World War II, the finishing of the division of Europe between Eastern and Western, communist and capitalist, permitted for encouraged development towards solidarity and integration in Europe, stamped by the development of the EU from 15 nations to 27 by 2007. What Napoleon had attempted to accomplish by constraint of arms after the French Revolution, the unification of Europe beneath the progressive standards of liberty, uniformity, and fraternity, was accomplished 2 centuries afterward through quiet and mass challenges and worldwide financial integration. To presentation in the long time between 1789 and 1989. Of course, Europe experienced numerous changes, a few of them indeed more convulsive than the transformations of 1789. Another seminal insurgency in Russia in 1917 brought to control a political party committed to another philosophy, communism, which inside 50 a long time was grasped by governments controlling half the populace of the planet. 2 world wars in the 20th century, battled primarily on European soil, fetched the lives of tens of millions of Europeans, both troopers and citizens. Brutal totalitarian tyrannies developed in Germany, Hitler, and Russia, Stalin, each causing wretchedness and passing on a scale exceptional in human history. At the same time, these 2 centuries were a period of gigantic, positive changes in imagination in Europe. The innovations of the mechanized turning wheel, steam motor, and gathering line fueled a mechanical insurgency, which influenced nearly each viewpoint of everyday life and changed European society from rural to urban. Adam Smith's thoughts around free endeavor impelled the development of capitalism, whereas the harsh edges and overabundances of free capitalism impelled Karl Marx to recommend an elective way of organizing urban life with the Communist Declaration. Charles Darwin revolutionized science with his hypothesis of advancement and to prepare challenging conventional and devout ideas approximately human creation. And in the middle of all this mature, Europe delivered a few of the most marvelous scholars, performers, and craftsmen of all time. To list them all would be both outlandish and impulsive, but I will take the author's privilege and say as it were a few of the most all-around known, and my claimed favorites Tolstoy, Dickens, Goethe and Flaubert, Beethoven, Mozart, Tchaikovsky and the Beatles, Renoir, Monet, and Picasso. These specialists, like the logicians of the edification and the transformations, molded the present-day culture of Europe and the world. In a few regards, the spreading impact of European culture to the rest of the world was generous. For illustration through resettlement, between 1840 and 1940, over 60 million individuals emigrated from Europe, the endless larger part of them to the Americas, taking with them the values, societies, and traditions of their countries. At the same time, European impact spread in less guiltless and frequently more destructive ways, with European government, which come to its apogee in the last mentioned half of the 19th century. Britain, Spain, France, Germany, Holland, Portugal, and other nations built up colonies all over the world in the 18th and 19th centuries. The prepare was especially quick, furious, and competitive in the period from 1870 to 1912, in what is now and then called the Scramble for Africa, when essentially the whole landmass was carved up into European colonies. By 1912, as it were Liberia and Ethiopia remained autonomous African states. Numerous of these colonies did not recapture their autonomy, altar, and convention in Europe III until the 1960s or afterward, by which time European social impacts, counting dialects, were profoundly embedded in colonial zones. French, for case, is still a national dialect in 28 nations. The developments for national freedom in Africa, Asia, and somewhere else frequently included a dismissal of European values, and indeed destructive threatening vibe from colonial people groups toward the Europeans who had misused them. Indeed so, the recently autonomous states nearly continuously borrowed their models for political and financial improvement from Europe, and the major competing ideologies, liberal vote-based system and socialism, were both basically European in beginning. An ignorant spectator, looking at Europe nowadays and Europe in 1789, might expect that there had been an unfaltering advancement and consolidation of the beliefs and thoughts of progressive France and edification Europe, a draft of modern structure for the EU. For illustration, made reference to the Union's obligation to the philosophical streams of the Enlightenment. And, without a doubt, the advance of the landmass along this line has been very surprising. From a collection of states characterized by outright government, inflexible social progression, labor, farming, and endemic fighting to an early European community of 27 states, all of them committed to majority-rule government, human rights, welfare capitalism, free development of merchandise and individuals, and tranquil interaction, advanced toward the beliefs of the Illumination, be that as it may, was not uniform or smooth. There were inalienable pressures between values of freedom and balance, between flexibility and arrange, between the needs of the person and those of the community, and eventually between the power for altar and those for convention. The French transformation disturbed the ancient arrange, the ancien regime, but the chaos, insecurity, and savagery that had unleashed panicked numerous individuals, particularly other European rulers and respectability. This driven to the reclamation of the government in France and the foundation of the heavenly organization together among the European rulers to guarantee the upkeep of the conventions of government, the church, and divine right. The Russian insurgency of 1917 driven to the intensive change in the Russian society and held out the Marxian guarantee of fabric wealth, social equity, balance, and worker solidarity both in Russia and around the world. But the between times dictatorship of the proletariat turned out to be semi-permanent, and the risk of communism frightened the capitalist world and made a division in Europe, what Winston Churchill called an Iron Curtain, that hindered European development and integration for eras. The financial uncertainties and misery of the 1920s startled sufficient individuals in Germany and Italy that they were willing to acknowledge charismatic, but demagogic, pioneers in Hitler and Mussolini, who guaranteed to reestablish a range in thriving, but to prepare unleashed a world war that caused a few 50 million fatalities in Europe alone. For presentation by the conclusion of the 20th century, Europe had come to numerous of the objectives set by logicians and progressives of the 18th century, but as it were, after numerous temporary routes and much enduring and injury. This book is a story of that turning away, from the Illumination to the EU, and the advancement of the thoughts of vote-based system, advance in human rights from the time of supreme government and divine right to a Europe joined together and free. In following these advancements, we will center on major subjects and thoughts and how they influence the landmass. It ought to be pointed out that the definition of Europe itself has been a subject of wrangle about and discussion among geographers, history specialists, and political pioneers. Since Europe is a huge promontory that extends from the Eurasian landmass out into the Atlantic, there is no totally clear border isolating Europe from Asia. Since the early 1800s, be that as it may, most geographers characterize the eastern constraint of Europe as being the Ural Mountains in Russia, which are almost 800 miles east of Moscow. As Russia itself extends thousands of miles eastbound past the Urals, this raises a lasting address of whether Russia is a portion of Europe. The issue is political and social, as well as geographic. As the history specialist Norman Davies has put it, throughout advanced history and standard absolutist, financially in reverse, but extending Russia has been an awful fit for consideration in Europe. Point one. But most Russian pioneers, from the Tsars to the communists of the show day, have seen Russia as a portion of Europe, and the nation has had gigantic impact, both politically and socially, on the improvement of Europe. In this course reading on European history, in this manner, we will incorporate Russia. The term Europe has a prescriptive and indeed idealistic measurement in expansion to the absolutely expressive one. As early as the 18th century, journalists, and rationalists pointed out the common establishments of European culture, particularly the Christian ones, and the conceivable outcomes of a more prominent European community. As it were as of late, in any case, has this appeared conceivable? After World War II, Jean Monnet, the father of Europe and the motivation behind the EU, conceded, Europe has never existed. One has truly to make Europe. The Cold War division of Europe into East and West appeared to put off this objective. The Soviet pioneer Mikhail Gorbachev restored this trust when he started his program of changing communism in the 1980s, hence raising the plausibility of a common European home. Europe, from the Atlantic to Urals, is a cultural historical substance joined together by the common legacy of the Renaissance and the edification of the extraordinary philosophical and social lessons of the 19th and 20th centuries. A colossal potential for approach of peace and neighborliness is inborn in the European social heritage point to altar and convention. In Europe 5, Gorbachev's changes unleashed the insurgencies of 1989, which brought down communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and cleared the way for that vision of a joined-together Europe. Amusingly, in spite of the fact that Gorbachev's claimed nation, Russia, is not portion of the EU, in a brief book like this, we cannot cover the history of each single nation in Europe. Or maybe we will center on specific nations amid imperative turning points. For illustration, France in 1789, Britain amid the mechanical transformation, Russia in 1917, Germany amid World War II, and Poland in 1989. We will start our travel with France. In the 18th century, on the eve of it to begin with extraordinary cutting-edge insurgency,